AP, welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom. Long time no see. Am I right? Yes, he did record these bad boys back to back. How does he do it? Everyone asks. I don't even know. So, going into it though, we need to understand that we're now moving into one of the most important things you will probably ever learn in this class. We are talking about the first attempt at absolutism to really hit the 1600s. We are talking about the rise of a new family known as the Stuarts, right? So we left off our last flip discussing what an absolutist is, what the constitutional government is, why absolutists popped up in the 1600s, also why they don't really work in England, right? Because of that little pesky parliament that stands in the way. Don't forget, bicameral, House of Lords, House of Commons, and the Commons has all the power, right? The Commons has the legitimate power, especially even in the modern era. The House of Lords is made up of nobles and landed nobles and stuff like that have landed estates. But the biggest thing that you have to understand about it is that basically they're kind of just a group that just writes laws into fancy language, right? In the modern era, so the Commons has a lot of power. But we discussed all that stuff. We also discussed what the Parliament does, right? We talked about how they pass laws, and we talked about all those different things, how they approve taxation, and we also discussed how kings in the past have done a really swimmingly good job of working with Parliament, right? And of course, Mr. Gillian is making faces and stuff like that outside of the flip while I'm actually doing it. So going into it, though, you need to understand, we are looking now at the rise of the Stuart family, though, because for those of you who have been playing along and focusing and going along and doing all that stuff, you got to understand, somebody's going to die one day. Well, everybody does. But in 1603, Elizabeth dies, right? Kylie Burke, I know this is a bad day for you. Don't cry, kid, all right? So don't cry. Put the tears back in. Suck them in. Now, going into it, though, you need to understand, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry. Back up. We got to talk about something.
Bag up, Terry. Put it in reverse, Terry. Put it in reverse. Oh, Lord, Jesus.
I know. So back up, Terry, real quick. Why is her death so important? Because for those of you who remember, Elizabeth never got married. If she never got married, she never had kids. If she never had kids, she never had descendants. If she didn't have any descendants, then who gets the throne when she dies, right? Well, the rules of the English monarchy state that it would then pass to her closest living relatives, right? Now, her closest living relative was her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, right? But why can't she get the throne? Well, because she's dead. So she's super dead because Elizabeth had her executed in that whole crazy story where, the wig came off and the dog ran out from under her dress, and then, there was a hit her in the back of the head, and then there was the Pez dispenser, and all that stuff, right? But Mary Queen of Scots is already dead. So who gets it now? Well, something that we talked about very briefly in class one day is you have to understand is that Mary Queen of Scots did have a son, right? Before she murdered her husband, Lord Darnley, and stuff like that, you have to understand that her and Lord Darnley did have a child together, right? And that child's name will be James, right? And so James is going to be the one that inherits the throne. This guy, right? So James the 6th of Scotland. And the first. We'll get to that in a moment. He is also a Protestant, so that's why the Parliament didn't mind him inheriting the throne whatsoever. But he is Scottish, which is interesting. Because they weren't the biggest fan of that. They were literally the Parliament was he's Scottish, but we'll take it, right? But he is Protestant, and he assumes the Anglican faith as well, but he does rise to prominence as the King of England in the year 1603, right? James VI, who was already the King of Scotland, is now also the King of England. But wait a minute, what's going on then, all right? So first of all, something that you have to understand is that's James. Get to know him. Look at him. Look at his goofy little beard, right? Now look, the thing about it, though, is he also has a very intense personality, and he's quite the figure, and I think he's hilarious in, European history. So something that you have to understand about what we're about to talk about, the Stuart monarchy in general is one of my very strange periods of expertise. Do not understand why this happened. Out of all the things in European history that I know stupid well, the Stuart monarchy is one of them, right? And I love talking about this guy. I think James VI is such a funny little figure because I think his arrival into the English monarchy and the Union of the Crowns, which we're about to talk about, is one of the most pivotal moments in European history, right? But this dude and his funny little personality, who absolutely hated Parliament, we'll get into that whole thing there in a minute, is a very, very important figure, right? But the thing is James didn't see himself like this. James saw himself like this, all right? So James really owned this whole idea that he was now not only the king of Scotland, but also the king of England, right? And you have to understand is that James the Sixth now becomes James the First. Do you see what happened there? So technically this guy has two numbers, all right? When you're looking him up in history, if you ever have a moment where you're looking him up using AI or trying to figure out a little bit more about him or get to know him a little bit better, you have to understand that James is also known as James the First and James the Sixth, right? Why is that? Because he's the first James of England, but he's the sixth James of Scotland, right? So whenever he comes to power, there's this big moment that happens called the Union of the Crowns, right? So literally, the King of England and the King of Scotland are now the same guy. So now technically Scotland and England fell underneath the same like rulership, right? So Scotland's king is now the same as England's king, and England's king is now the same as Scotland's king. And so basically what ends up happening though in this moment is we see the union of these two areas into one consolidated kingdom, right? Now going into it though, also you have to understand is that James is a very, very famous figure. He's very, very wealthy. He's very flamboyant in his personality. He also has a very famous Shakespeare play that was inspired by him, none other than the play of Macbeth, because literally he thought witches cast a spell on him when he was like on his way down in a boat and there was a big storm. So like now going into it though, you have to understand that James is a very, very prominent figure, mostly due to the fact that he's going to attempt to be an absolute ruler in England, right? Because he thinks he is. All right, so yeah, you have to understand is that James the First believes he's an absolute ruler, right? He thinks that he is an absolute ruler with divine right rulership, right? But his biggest problems coming into his rulership are he has to deal with some religious divides in the parliament, right? And now these problems are kind of one and the same, right? So the religious divide problem is affecting the parliament, and the parliament is affecting him. And so all of this stuff kind of goes into a big grab bag of things that he can't stand, right? So like now, like so, but you have to understand in the long run is that James legitimately believed that he should be allowed to have complete authority, that England was now his kingdom, Scotland was his kingdom, and whatever he said would happen, right? But the issue is, though, is that Parliament is not about to let that happen, right? So one of the biggest issues that he's dealing with early on is religious division, coming off the heels of the Reformation. Because for looking at the year that he came into power in 1603, many of you that are tracking your dates, and I know like Riley Pinto was really big on knowing when things happened and stuff like that. I really appreciate that from you, kid. Keep up the good work. You have to understand he comes into power in 1603, so the 30 Years' War hasn't even happened yet, right? So the Reformation is still really in a full kick, right? Because it's only been going down for about 80 years, right? And a lot of other groups are starting to leave, and then we got religious violence breaking out. The French wars of religion are full bore in France at this moment, right? But what he's got to deal with is a very unique set of religious division, and what he's got to deal with is this stuff right here. This stuff. There we go. He's got to deal with these people known as the Puritans, right? The Puritans are giving him a really, really huge problem, right? And the Puritans, again, let's talk about who they are, right? The Puritans, all right, are that same group of Calvinists that have come back to England after being gone for a little while. So basically the theory that states of who the Puritans are is that basically the Puritans are these Protestants, right, that are under the Anglican Church as well, and they respect the Anglican Church, right? The Puritans are like, okay, we can get down with this whole Anglicanism thing. But the reason why they're called Puritans is because when they ran away from England, whenever Mary came to power, because Mary took England back to Catholicism, Mary the First, Bloody Mary, right? They run away to Switzerland, and they learn in Calvin's Geneva how to be super strict, how to only wear black and white, how to literally regulate everything, how to have long masses, how to have no fun, how to outlaw alcohol, right? Basically, though, the Puritans, the no fun having Puritans, the ones that you learned about in Mr. Roddy's class, are a big thorn in James's side, right? Because you're now dealing with this big issue where they are rebelling against him. Not in a full violent one, but in a very, very parliamentarian one. Because Puritans want a social revolution, right? They want to outlaw alcohol in England. They want to close theaters because they think singing distracts from God and stuff like that, right? You know, you met them. They'd rather accuse somebody of being a witch than sing a song. But going into it, you have to understand is that a lot of them are now also getting elected into parliamentary office, right? So a lot of them are now being elected into the parliament, especially from their different districts of England. And why they're called Puritans is because they want to purify, quote unquote, the Anglican Church of its Catholic elements, right? Because remember, the Anglican Church early on was just diet Catholic until Henry started being we don't need priests, I want that land. We'll let them get married, I guess, later on. So now you have to understand though, is that they want to get rid of all things that smell of Catholic inside the Anglican Church, hence why they're called Puritans, right? Well, the thing is that they are getting some guff, right? And the kings and queens are pushing back against them, and they don't want to give in to these social revolutions and divides that go against a lot of different English cultural values. And so they end up actually breaking into two groups, and you have Puritans, and then you have Puritan separatists, right? See, now here, separatists, those guys are going to be the ones that end up going off and founding the Plymouth colony, right? And they do that in 1610, okay? So what you need to understand about this entire kerfuffle, right, is that going into it, he's got to deal with them, right? And then also, literally, they want to go against the different Catholic elements. They want to get rid of the bishop because they think bishops are way too Catholic, because they are. I mean, like, bishops exist in Catholic churches as well. And James fought back against this, being like, well, if you have no bishop, you might as well have no king, right? And he basically just said, is like, look, that's stupid. You need a leader of your church. And so he refused to give in to them in that moment. But interesting little fact about James is he does try to give them concessions to try to keep them from being super stupid annoying, right? For example, he creates an English version of the Bible, right? He has the Bible translated into vernacular English, and it's known as the King James Version of the Bible. For any of y'all that were raised in a Protestant church, you probably interacted with it before, right? Now, going into it, though, you also have to understand that James himself is the son of a Catholic. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic, right? And a lot of Catholics in England were really upset when she died because they thought that she was their true queen, right? Now, the interesting thing about it, though, is he is tolerant of them, and he doesn't want to have them murdered or arrested or anything, but he is going to ban public worship just like Elizabeth did, right? Being like, hey, you cannot worship in public, and if you do it at all, you better do it at home, and we better not see you, right? And if you're a Catholic priest, stop it. And like literally it led to this entire thing of being an at-home Catholic. And literally some houses in England actually to this day have holes in the ground underneath their kitchen floors and stuff like that you can pull up a trap door, and it's called a priest hole. And like literally Catholics used to hide like Catholic priests down there and be like, peekaboo, I need Eucharist. And literally just keep them safe from being arrested by like Anglican or church authorities. So going into it though, also the Catholics were forced to attend church mass. Now stuff like this is going to really make him mad, or not make him mad, but really make the Catholics themselves upset, right? And it actually early on in his rule led to a very big moment, right? And I need you to write this down because this is the kind of stuff that James was dealing with, right? And ironically enough, he did a pretty decent job at dealing with it, right? And so one of the biggest things that actually went down is this thing known as the gunpowder plot, okay? Write that down really quick for me, the gunpowder plot. And it happened 2 years into his rulership, right? And the gunpowder plot happened on November 5th, 1605, right? And how does Mr. Terry remember that? Because there's a fun little rhyme that goes with it here in a minute, and I'll tell you about it in a second. But what happened was in the gunpowder plot is this guy, a man by the name of Guy Fawkes, right? Fawkes spelled Fawkes, right? Actually tried to blow him up. So yeah, him and some Catholic conspirators, because they were some of these secret Catholics in England, right? That would have rather have seen a Catholic leader come to power, and they wanted to be allowed to worship openly, and they didn't want these really strict regulatory laws on them. They decide, you know what? If he doesn't like us, this whole no bishop, no king nonsense, this guy that we don't like, right? Let's kill him, all right? And so when he was supposed to come down to Parliament, they took a buttload of gunpowder barrels and put them in the basement, right? It was him and 6 buddies did this together. Well, what happened was one of those 6 buddies got arrested and then narked everybody out, right? And so Guy Fawkes actually also got arrested as well. And what ends up going down with that is that oh, wait, what did I do? Oh, yeah, so what ends up going down with that in that moment is he actually gets arrested after almost attempting to blow up the king, and literally they end up hanging him and stuff like that, and it's known as the gunpowder plot, right? And so they actually celebrate this holiday every single year in England, and it's called Gunpowder Day, right, on November 5th, okay? And they like get off for school, and they have these big bonfires and stuff like that. It's a really cool day. I think personally we should celebrate it in class, but there's a fun little like rhyme that goes with it as well, so nobody ever forgets it in England, right? And it's remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I should think of no reason why the gunpowder treason shall ever be forgot, right? Which is one of my favorite little things to talk about because the king literally almost got blown up, right? Like so. Now, interesting thing about it as well, though, is if you've ever seen this mask before, Guy Fawkes' face is now known as a symbol of political dissent, right? So basically, there's this guy on YouTube and stuff like that, anonymous, who like does leaks or crap like that, and he wears a Guy Fawkes mask, right? So it's kind of interesting that like literally a thing of James's era still lives on to this day, right? And it also became an anti-Catholic holiday, which is absolutely wild, right? Now, going into it, though, but that's a good example of the religious division that James is having to deal with. But the better question is, though, but why does he hate Parliament so much, right? Because I think what we need to really hone in on as well is James hates Parliament. And some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, does he really hate Parliament because there are Puritans in it? Or does he just hate Parliament in general? Well, he actually just hates Parliament in general. Even if it was full of Anglicans, you know what I mean? Like, he would still not like it. Due to the fact that he believes that him and his sons deserve to be divine right rulers, right? He genuinely believes that him and his sons should have to answer to no one and should be allowed to do whatever the front door they want, whenever the front door they want, right? And a lot of it, though, he has a problem, though. He can't do that because of none other than the Magna Carta. Yeah! Exactly. That document right there is the thing that actually set up the parliamentary procedure that England would actually revolve around. Now, did it do it directly? No. Did it set it up over time? Yes. All right, so like this document, of course known as the Magna Carta, is the thing that creates the legislative body system that's going to actually rule over everything in England. It's going to be the thing that stands in the way of James of ever being an absolute monarch, because literally he's always going to be a constitutional one, because they have a document that actually limits his power, right? Because it literally says that he has to actually prevent, like, he's not allowed to raise taxes unjustly. He's not allowed to imprison without cause. He must recognize habeas corpus rights. These documents that actually expel, like, the outline rights are constitutions in themselves, right? But the thing about it, though, is he going to try to go around this document and try to get his money and do all his little stuff as well because he believes he's a divine right ruler? Of course he is. And he pisses off Parliament big time whenever he tries to do a lot of different things, right? Like, for example, he tries to increase tonnage and poundage, which is a actual tax that actually kind of basically filled the piggy bank of every single king in England. What tonnage and poundage is, it all has to do with a tax on wine, right? So like in England, you can't like grow grapes because it just won't grow. And so like literally the ton right there is not referring to a weight, it's referring to a ton of wine, right? And a ton is like a cask of wine or a barrel of it, right? And poundage is referring to actually the tax that goes on to those casks of wine. So that one tax in particular went straight to the king, right? And he wanted to increase it, but the Parliament was like, no, you may not do that. You must like pass all tax increases by us. So James was like, how dare you do that, right? And then also he executed like Sir Walter Raleigh, which is pretty messed up. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, and Sir Walter Raleigh was literally one of the Queen, right? Queen Elizabeth's closest friends, okay? And he has him executed because he like what he believes does that, or what he believed that he violated rules of the crown, right? So that made him look pretty bad, right? And then also there's this guy. So like now, something that you have to understand, though, is what did James want all this money for, right? He wanted all this money so he could, like, renovate Whitehall Palace, and he could spend it on himself, and he loved living a lavish lifestyle, right? James loved to spend money on himself and have huge parties and things like that, and he loved to just have, like, a king's court, like he had heard about so many other kings and rulers having in different areas of Europe, right? Well, interesting little fact of the matter is you have to sometimes when you're looking at a king, look at their closest advisor, right? And their his closest advisor, James's closest advisor, was this guy named the Duke of Buckingham, right? The Duke of Buckingham, right? And the Duke of Buckingham, right? Buckingham, right? Also known as George Villiers. This guy was his closest advisor. And the only reason that he was even a noble at all is because of the conspiracy, literally, the Duke of Buckingham used to be another guy, and then that guy got divorced, and then all this other stuff happened, and then James basically nullified his nobility and then replaced him with this dude, right? Well, a lot of people had a lot of theories about this, right? So they were very close, so extremely close. A lot of people said they might have been together right now, but we don't know that for sure, but we do believe that there's a chance, and we'll talk about it later on. But also going into it as well, a lot of the parliamentarians hated this guy because they thought that he was the one telling James to increase taxes, have parties all the time, do all this stuff. And it got so bad at one point that the Parliament used to say something really mean about James, and they used to say that when we had Elizabeth, we had our king, and now we have James, our queen, which is really messed up and super mean. So like now going into it though, as you can see, there's a lot of controversy swirling around James as well, leading to him having a bad taste in the Parliament's mouth, right? And so going into it though, also as you understand, is that James is going to age, right? And his rule is not actually even that long. He has a couple of other really big memorable moments inside of his rule though, but a lot of it is defined by his struggles with Parliament of trying to increase taxes and bring more money and wealth to himself because he believes he's an absolute ruler, but he never actually really achieves it, right? And so in James, so some of his other memorable moments include like the creation of Jamestown, which is the colony that was directly named after him. That same colony, you know, that you've probably heard of because of Disney. John Smith was there a couple of times, but John Rolfe was the guy that really led the thing. And then, so like Jamestown though would be like actually created underneath him, hence why it was called Jamestown, right? And also Plymouth, he does grant a charter to the Puritan separatists to go off and create Plymouth and stuff like that. And then also, the biggest thing about him is he kept Britain out of the 30 Years' War, right? The British never got involved with the 30 Years' War, like whatsoever. And a lot of it is because James refused to actually play that game, right? And he stayed out of it, and he managed to actually stay in a peacetime policy, right? Which you gotta give him credit for that, because literally he didn't get sucked into an intercontinental religious war that ended up wrecking the continent for generations, right? But the thing that you also have to understand, though, is his feuds with Parliament are gonna get really, really aggressive, because Parliament would do a lot of little things to try and like stall him out, right? He wanted more money, so they would stall voting, right? To make it so he would run out of it eventually and have to come and beg and plead for it. But something that you have to understand about kings of England is they did have a little bit of an ace up their sleeve, right? Now, what I mean by that is literally like a little trick that they could pull off, right? And that trick was doing this, dissolving Parliament, right? So this is something that we need to understand, is that in England, during times of emergency, the king is allowed to dissolve Parliament, right? To create a more efficient government system, to make it so if they have to raise an army very quickly, or to make it so that if they actually have to try and create a new parliament with emergency elections, they are allowed to do this. You're not supposed to do it when they make you mad because they won't give you more money. So literally he was like, how dare you make me ask questions? And he just dissolved them and fired all of them in 1622. And then he died a few years later, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that this isn't unheard of. He wouldn't be the first king to do this. He definitely wouldn't be the last king to do this. But it was not for the right reason, right? And the problem is that's going to affect his son, all right? So now, his son will actually be the guy that actually brings up the reins after him. And the issue that you really have when we look at James is the fact that he kind of put into his son's mind that he was an absolutist, that his son would one day be an absolutist. And that was not the best idea, James, because we now have another guy rising to the throne who believes a lot of similar things to that what his dad believes in, right? And his name is Charles I, right? And Charles I comes in, and he now has had a bad role model try and show him how to rule, and Charles I comes in here, and he decides to really shake some things up. So much so that things get a little out of hand, right? And to give you a little bit of background about Charles, just in general, Charles is a very, very important figure in English history, right? And the reason why is because he leads to a really, really, really violent and chaotic war. And something that we also need to understand as well is that he basically is going to lead, we'll get there. But anyway, so Charles's background, first and foremost, is that he is one of James's two sons, right? He's actually the younger of James's two sons, right? His other brother was named Henry. Now, Henry would have risen to the throne as Henry IX, but the thing about it is that despite everyone wanting his brother to live, because his brother was athletic and strong and magnanimous and very, very smart, whereas Charles was born a very sickly child, right? So you have to understand, like, he couldn't even go to London whenever James was, brought in as king, due to the fact that literally he was too sick all the time to survive the trip, and they were worried he might die, right? So he had to stay back in Scotland while his dad was down there feuding with Parliament all the time. And his brother Henry actually died of like a sudden fever, right? Now, the thing about it that's going to end up happening, though, is when Henry dies, that means Charles is now next up. Charles was very short. He only grew to be about 5'4". He was also incredibly skinny because literally he used to run miles and miles a day because he thought that would make him physically fit, and it just made him incredibly tiny. And he also had a stammer that he talked with, right? Like a stutter and stuff like that. And the issue with that was that literally it just didn't make him very good for accepting different roles or giving speeches to Parliament, because the king has to open Parliament every single season. And so he actually tried to train himself to undo that stammer by putting rocks in his mouth and trying to speak with those in his mouth. Apparently shattered one of his teeth. And then also on top of all this stuff is that when his dad died, he was unmarried, right? He was not married at the time. And that's a little bit of an issue, because if you gotta have a king, you're supposed to have a queen, and because you want the Stuart line to keep rolling, so they need to have kids and stuff. And so when he got married about 3 months after his dad died, and he decided to marry one of his distant relatives. And his dad actually set this whole thing up. And her name was Henrietta Maria, and she's from France, and she is a Catholic. And that made everybody in England feel a lot like this.
Hey, yo, what the?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because they're like, whoa, Catholic, what? No, literally, everything is getting started off bad for this guy, right? He also believes in divine right rulership, but not really the version of it that his dad believed in, right? James's version of divine right rulership was let's party, hang out, and have a court, whereas Charles's version of it was growing power and growing his glory, right? And he wanted to use war to actually best exert that. Now, a really interesting little factor about this is, yet again, who is his closest advisor? None other than George Villiers, that guy, the Duke of Buckingham, who may or may not have been with his dad. Now, we don't know, but for sure, again, but like now, going into it though, the Duke of Buckingham apparently influenced him in a lot of ways to go off and fight wars and stuff like that. And every single time he would go off and fight a war, it would fail miserably, right? And the thing about it is that wars are also very expensive. So every time he wanted to go invade places like Spain or invade places like France or get involved a little bit with the 30 Years' War, Parliament would refuse to raise taxes, and they'd be like, no, we don't want to get into the 30 Years' War. This whole thing going on with France and the Habsburgs is terrible. It's killing millions of people, and it's also wasting all of their money, so we don't want to do that. So every single time he needed money for a war, if he could get it, he usually didn't, like, if the Parliament refused to actually raise these taxes, they already didn't like him because of his wife and like a bunch of other stuff. He would dissolve them, right? But the issue is that he didn't do this once. Charles dissolved Parliament multiple different times, right? He dissolved Parliament 3 different times, right? And a lot of this he did actually out of anger and frustration, right? And every single time he did it is because they were refusing to give him money, right? Now, one time when they brought him back, he actually brought them back for like a hot second before he went off and invaded like France and stuff like that. And that period of time was known as the Short Parliament because he brought them back and stuff like that. And they were like, no, and then he just fires them again. But when they bring him back, they tell him, we will not raise taxes, we won't give you money for this war unless you sign this document called the Petition of Right, which a lot of people refer to as like the Magna Carta 2.0. Exactly. So, like, going into it, though, the Petition of Right said that he wasn't allowed to imprison people without, like, a just cause, and it also gave people, like, the right to, he couldn't strip land or, like, possess or repossess any of their stuff, trying to gain money to actually go off and fight wars. So the thing that's going to end up happening, though, is, like, after he dissolves them again, at one point, he tries to rule by himself for 11 years, right? And this period of time was that he called his personal rule, everybody else in England called the 11 years of tyranny, right? Now, we'll talk about that in class, though, okay, whenever I see y'all soon, because the 11 years of tyranny is a very pivotal moment in this whole story, because it's going to lead to a nice, big civil war, all right? But we'll talk about that soon. Y'all have a good one.